During the Great Depression, food prices had collapsed, and this had a dire effect on many farmers' livelihoods. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 was intended to solve this problem. The act levied special taxes on processed agricultural products, such as cotton and wheat. The new tax revenue was then used to pay farmers to plant and harvest fewer crops. Reduced agricultural production would allow prices to rise, which helped farmers to once again earn a living. In 1936, the act was challenged in the case of United States versus Butler. Hoosac Mills was a failing Massachusetts cotton mill, and Butler was one of its court-appointed receivers. The United States submitted an $81,000 claim for taxes under the act, but the receivers asked the federal district court to reject the claim. The court ordered the mill's receivers to pay the tax, and the receivers appealed. The Court of Appeals reversed the district court's decision, holding that the power to regulate agriculture within state borders was solely reserved to the states. The government petitioned for review, and the United States Supreme Court granted cert. The court considered two questions regarding the scope of Congress's authority to tax and spend. First, it examined whether Congress's power to tax and spend for the general welfare was limited to exercising specifically enumerated powers, or if the authority was broader. Second, the court also examined whether Congress could use its taxing and spending power to regulate local agricultural production, or if instead the 10th Amendment reserved that power to the states. Writing for the court, Justice Owen Roberts held that the Taxing and Spending Clause was an independent grant of power to Congress, giving it broad authority to tax and spend for the general welfare, and not merely a means of exercising other enumerated powers. However, the court also held that this power couldn't be used to achieve unconstitutional goals, such as violating the 10th Amendment. Questions regarding the scope of Congress's power to tax and spend had lingered since the nation's founding. James Madison had argued for a limited taxing and spending power only to be used in support of Congress's other enumerated powers. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, supported broader authority to tax and spend for the general welfare. Roberts reasoned that Congress's power to tax and spend as a means of carrying out enumerated powers is already implied in the grant of those powers. If the framers had intended Congress to tax and spend only in furtherance of other enumerated powers, then the constitutional language, quote, "to provide for the common defense and the general welfare," unquote, would be rendered meaningless. A primary rule of constitutional and statutory construction is that language shouldn't be interpreted in a way that renders it meaningless. In this case, Congress taxed agricultural processing for the purpose of raising the prices of farm products. This was clearly related to the general welfare of the United States because the collapse in food prices had forced many farmers out of business across the country. The act was therefore a valid exercise of Congress's taxing and spending power. This holding didn't decide the case, however. The majority then considered the second question, whether the 10th Amendment reserved agricultural regulation solely to the states. Because the power to regulate agriculture wasn't specifically granted to Congress, the court found that the power was reserved to the states by the 10th Amendment. By offering financial incentives to farmers to reduce their production, Congress sought to regulate agriculture within the states, which the Constitution didn't authorize. The majority ruled that the act was an unconstitutional intrusion on state authority. The court affirmed the decision of the Court of Appeals, and the act was struck down as unconstitutional. Justice Stone dissented, joined by Justices Cardozo and Brandeis. They agreed that the Taxing and Spending Clause granted Congress a broad power to tax and spend for the general welfare. However, the dissenters believed that this power wasn't limited by the fact that it could impact areas that were traditionally reserved to the states. United States versus Butler is not remembered for striking down the Agricultural Adjustment Act because the same taxing provisions were quickly reenacted by Congress under its Commerce Clause authority and later upheld by the Supreme Court. Instead, Butler is a landmark case because it expressly held that the Taxing and Spending Clause is a separate grant of congressional authority, not limited to supporting Congress's other enumerated powers.